Good afternoon. I'm glad you all chose to come and see this presentation this afternoon. Is the parade still going on at 1 o'clock? Yeah. I figured, my bait is the air conditioning. So I really do appreciate you coming out. Everybody enjoying the rain?
If anyone feels they need to move forward, don't worry about it during the presentation. Please move forward with your chair, whatever it takes to be.
The slides are going to display kind of small. They didn't give us a screen, so this is the best we were able to do with the projector. And the slides are probably the bulk of what I've got to do here today. With the sound, I'm going to try and speak slowly because of the echo in here. I'll do the best I can. If you have any problems hearing, don't be afraid to speak up and tell me to repeat something or whatever. So, with that, I wanted to ask a few questions. A couple of these may sound a little like the answer's a bit obvious, but I am going somewhere with this, so just be patient with me. First off, how many of you collect tractors? I'd expect a pretty good answer for that. How many of you collect IH tractors? Good, right? How many of you focus on a particular model of IH tractor? Not much in the way of specialization here. Maybe the more interesting question that people may come up and ask you from time to time is why do you collect tractors? Why do you collect IH tractors? Why do you collect this particular model? I don't know if you've ever been asked that, but I certainly have. I've had days when my tractors behave badly enough, I've asked myself those questions. And the answer almost drove me to the phone to call my auctioneer. That said, what I'm going to try and go through today is kind of how I got interested in collecting tractors, my history with collecting, and why I ended up collecting the models of tractors that I collect. From the title of the presentation, I think it's something like the Moguls and the McCormicks, and you may have thought this was going to be some discussion of the connection between the McCormick family name and the Mogul tractors, but that's actually not what it is. It's going to be about the tractors that I collect, which are McCormick during W40s, WD40s, and large early Mogul tractors. So just a couple more questions here. How many WD40s are at the show this year? Do what? Okay, that's kind of the answer I would expect. So that may be a little tip off of why I get interested in collecting something like that. How many Mogul tractors are here at the show? Yeah, there's the big Titan and the Mogul. So again, kind of the answer I would expect. I'll warn you all in advance, this presentation is PG-13 because there are pictures of tractors other than International Harvester tractors in the presentation. So bear with me while I get this rolling. Hopefully it will wake up. Pardon? Oh, I already did that. So. It just takes a while to warm up. That's all it is.
55 green. 2 points.
Well, we don't seem to be able to wait this thing out. I said there was too long. Maybe we won't have a slideshow. It's starting to come up a little bit. part to some of these questions I asked. I grew up in a small town in Missouri with my dad, Herb, and my grandfather had farmed on a small scale with his brothers. They operated a sawmill, first on steam and later with old straight 8 Buick car engines that they'd harvested out of junk cars. My dad's uncles had even owned a 4-wheel drive Massey Harris tractor at one point and used it for skidding logs to the sawmill. This tractor met its demise when it drove over a tree stump and broke the transmission case. So my father had grown up around machinery, but I didn't grow up on a farm and wasn't a farmer by any stretch of the imagination. So you might say, well, why did I become interested in collecting antique tractors at all? And more specifically, why the interest in International Harvester? This tractor, this is not a real good picture, but is at least an answer to the first part of that question. My grandfather bought this tractor in 1950, and this is a 1950 vintage photograph from a man who had been badly burned in a fire. And they had an auction at his farm, and he got this tractor in 1928 Farmall Regular, which I still have. And so that was sort of a natural interest in International and in these tractors. And the tractor had sat out in the yard at our house for as long as I could remember and did not run. The engine was stuck, and my dad always told the story, well, we quit running it because it had a flat crankshaft. And that was the end of the story. We never really talked a whole lot about getting it running again. Thought that it would be cost prohibitive. Turned out, when we actually decided to work on the tractor and got into it, the flat crankshaft was just the flywheel was loose on the crankshaft and it banged around, and that was creating the noise that caused it to stop running. That's what the tractor looked like in the 80s after we got it going again. A friend and a local collector had offered us the use of his shop. We didn't have any facilities at that time, and his knowledge to help us get this tractor running again. So we put new pistons and sleeves in it, painted it up, and that's what we had for a time. And I didn't really know a lot about tractor collecting. A lot of other tractor collectors, that this is what people did for a hobby. We just knew we had this. We were the family in town with the tractor that had the iron wheels on it. That's pretty much the end of the story. Well, then I got interested in John Deere tractors. My uncles on the other side of the family had John Deere tractors, and I thought, that would be kind of fun. 2 cylinders, made different. I could get interested in that. So I found out that my dad, one of his cousins, had a sort of a junk business, and he had a John Deere tractor sitting on the lot that I might be able to salvage. And so I took $200 from my lawn mowing business, and I bought a 1942 B John Deere. This would have been about 1982. So this was my first adventure in actually buying a tractor. We dragged it home with my dad's 1976 Buick Skylark because, again, we had, really didn't know anything, didn't have anything. Drug it home, got it running, and that was my second tractor. But things were starting to pick up steam as far as interest in tractor collecting. We started to go to shows, tractor pulls. There were antique tractor pulls around, and started to see some books become available. I think the early 80s is probably around the time that C.H. Wendell's 150 Years of International Harvester came out. So Alan King had some books that were available. So it was, I was starting to learn a little bit more about the tractors. And while driving on Highway 50 near Nostrum, Missouri, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the area, but there was a fellow on that stretch of road that sold mobile homes. Can't remember his name right offhand, but sitting on the lot with the mobile homes was a 1936 F12 with single front wheel, 3 flat tires. But I had to have it. So that was my third tractor, and I don't have a picture of it, but I did end up with that, had it for a time, got it running. It was referred to locally as the F-12 steam engine because the head gasket was not in the best of shape. I never really got around to doing much about it. Then there were the other John Deeres. I got really interested in D John Deeres as a result of a tractor that was on display at the local John Deere dealership in Warrensburg, Missouri. It was known locally as the Meyerdix D. It was a 1936 D John Deere that the dealer had acquired from local farmers, the Meyerdix brothers. And the joke about them is they were said to have mouse-type barns. I don't know if anybody can truly have a mouse-type barn, but that was the claim about them. That was the first D John Deere I'd ever seen in person. So I started, I had to see more, and I looked for and found that this 28 D John Deere, which the only real tie in international harvester here is those rear tires were probably part of a dual tire kit for like an F30. But they've been adapted to these wheels. They're 500 by 44s. If you think they're odd tires, fine, that definitely would qualify. And that was my 1937 D John Deere that I bought from a local farmer. And I enjoyed these tractors, for a while. Then I went, this is what they looked like after they were fixed up a little better. That's the 28D, and there's the 37D. And then, everything broke loose, and I started getting interested in Wheatland tractors generally, and I thought, well, maybe that's a way to go, specialize in Wheatland tractors. So I found the E-Alice. That was a nice looking standard tractor, I thought. And sort of got sidetracked into Alice Chalmers for a while, my dad and I. And we bought this, which was a 1935 L Alice bulldozer, 10-foot Baker blade, about 35 to 40,000 pounds of blade on it. So we bought it from a guy in town, had an auction at his house, and we had agreed to help him get the tractor going for the auction. Well, it didn't get bid too high at the auction, so I bought it and drove it home from the sale. We laid down rubber tires on the paved road so we could get home without tearing up any roads. And there were the Twin Cities. There was a detour into Twin City for a while. This was my 2035, and I actually do still have it. This is now, I think, the only non-international harvester tractor I have left in my collection. I've got about 65 tractors altogether now, I think, and that's the only non-IH tractor that's left. Some of the others were this 2132 Twin City that I no longer have. The Z Minneapolis and a G6 diesel. That was probably the latest model that I owned at the time. Now I think the latest tractor I own is the 686 International that I bought from Jerry Smoker, who's in the back row. And then there was this, which I still regret getting rid of this. This was a Twin City tractor that's fairly rare. There's only about 8 or 9 of these left, and only 2 that are constructed like this one. When I bought it in central Kansas, bought it fairly cheap, but never could figure out how to acquire all the parts it was going to take to get it going. If you wonder how big a tractor that is, the rear wheels are 7 feet tall. So it's a good sized piece of equipment. That was Twin Cities next to the smallest tractor they built at the time. And it weighed about 18,000 pounds if it was complete.
What model was that?
2545, or I guess they popularly call it 25. They built a 1530, a 2545, 4565, and then the 6090 is the big 6-cylinder. That is what's left of the radiator. The shell on the outside of it's gone, but those are the tubes that the air got pulled through and the water flowed all around those tubes. And we had a couple of Wallaces, again, kind of suited my interest to wide front end tractors. While we had the Farmall, I wasn't the B John Deere, I wasn't that interested in row crop tractors. I'd never been a farmer. They just didn't look good to me, but I knew they had use, I just didn't fully appreciate it. Another Wallace, that's a 1920K Wallace. L case that I had for a time. And then I went to a tractor pull in Sweet Springs, Missouri. I don't have a picture of this tractor, but I saw for the first time a WK-40 tractor pull in Sweet Springs, Missouri, and I got really excited about that. This is the kind of tractor I really love. And sort of the idea that, well, Jack Walter had an auction in January of 1987, and there were so many pieces of 40 horsepower equipment on that sale. I thought surely I can come up with something new. And we got to the sale, there's snow on the ground, and there are just 40s everywhere. Some of them carcasses, some of them complete tractors, ID 40s, which is the industrial variant of the WD-40, power units, just all kinds of stuff. So we went to the auction with the intent of buying the ID-40 because there were only 238 of them made. I thought this would really be a feather in my cap if I could get this. Well, we didn't get it, and it turns out we came up with 6 things at the sale. We got a WD-40 that I didn't know too much about. It was kind of rusty and rough, but all there. A W40, 1938 W40, needed rear tires, but luckily he sold a set of rear tires on the sale, and for those of you that don't know the difficulty there, they're large 32-inch tire, large for the time, like 1432, 1532. Virtually impossible to find then, and almost absolutely impossible to find now. But we got a set of tires at the auction, a WD-40 injection pump, and a PD-40 power unit, and a parts book for the W40s and WD-40s, which would prove to be very useful. So, of course, we'd driven to the sale in a car, so nothing came home with us. We had to come home, hire a truck, go back and haul everything home. But that was sort of the beginning of having some 40 horsepower stuff in my collection. That's a picture on the left. It's a little hard to see, but on the left is the 1938 W40 that we bought at Jack's sale. That was in Cary, Ohio in 1987. And then I got a few more WD-40s that I found here and there. And partly because of a discovery that I made when I got this WD-40 home. I got really interested in serial numbers and knowing, the serial numbers of the surviving tractors. So my dad and I published a letter to everybody we could get a hold of that we knew, asking them for information on the 40s that they knew about. What were the serial numbers, casting dates. The reason we were interested in some of that is this tractor, when I got it home, it appeared to have no serial tag on it. But it had an add-on oil filter on the firewall, on the left side of the firewall. I don't know who made it, if it was an M&W attachment or what it was, but it was an extra oil filter. And I could see after we got it home, there was just a little strip of shiny metal showing up from behind the steel plate that attached to the firewall. So I took that off to see what was going on. And sure enough, it was a serial tag for that tractor on the wrong side of the firewall. It was on the left side instead of the right. And the serial number turned out to be 503, which made it a very early WD-40. Well, I paid $1,700 for the tractor, so I thought I'd made a real buy there, and it turned out I had. And at a previous Red Power, I gave a whole talk on that aspect of WD-40 so I won't get into that again, but that was another thing that sucked me further into the mire on WD-40s, was that I had very early when they were, that was pretty good. So the number of 40s started to grow. We sent out this, you can't see it on here, but that's basically the output from one of our serial number searches that we did. And that's just surviving WD-40s, just on, and there were like 4 or 5 pages of them. So it turns out to be a more common tractor than most people would believe. I would say there are probably 200 or 300 of them. Anyway, out of the 3,370 that were made. But still, you never see them in shows probably because they're a bit of a handful to haul if you're used to hauling F20s and M's and H's. The WD-40 is a good bit more weight, and it's hard to keep running. And these are some, this is when I had the 40s that I had at the time on display at the Chilhowie, Missouri show that we were members of. I should point out they banned me from coming to any further shows because every year I'd show up at their show, it would get rained out. Not like here today, maybe I can rain here. And then a couple of things happened that caused me to really increase the number of 40s that I had. One was that a family in Kemptville, Ontario had been going through their files when the father passed away, and they found my letter from the serial number search. And they reached out to me and said, hey, we'd like to, we found your name, we saw you were searching for serial numbers for these, we've got about 9 of these WD-40s and a lot of parts. We need to know what the stuff's worth. And later, it turned out that I was able to make an offer for the whole collection. I think it was 8 complete tractors, a parts tractor, and 11 pallets of parts for WD-40s. And so they got on the trucks and made the trip down to northwest Indiana where I live. And this was one of the tractors that came home on that route. This is serial number 715, I think, and if I go back, this gray tractor in that picture is one of mine, it's serial number 716, so that's the only consecutive pair that I have. And then I was at the Madison Roundup in Madison, Wisconsin. And I met an old friend that I'd corresponded with for years about 40s, Alan Smith. Some of you may know Alan Smith. You may not. He was probably more of a Caterpillar collector than a 40 collector. But I met him at that show, and he informed me that he had throat cancer, and his doctor said he was probably about 2 months past the line, and he should have been gone. His stuff was probably going to be available. I felt bad about that because Alan and I had traded a lot of information over the years. And then I didn't hear any more about it other than I did, I think, become aware that he'd passed away. Well, he had bought a lot of parts from a guy that maybe a number of us have bought parts from over the years, Tom Underwood. And Tom was helping them. He was buying back some of the new old stock parts that Alan had bought for IH tractors. And he said, hey, you know, Eric Best might be interested in some of this stuff too. And so Alan's daughter, Arlene, got a hold of me and said, hey, would you be interested in any of this stuff? Well, he had 2 complete WD-40s, TD-40s, TA-40s, power units, PA-100 power unit. And I ended up, you know, for that, all the parts I could find on the place, we ended up making an offer, and I bought those tractors from Alan's estate. And this was one of the tractors that was interesting. I know it's a little hard to see, but it's a 1936 TA-40 crawler with factory glass enclosed cab. And most of the glass is intact. It's a pretty rusty piece, but I thought it was pretty cool. So we got that in as well. So working on 40s, I became aware of Wendell Kelch because he was one of the few shops in the country that would work on a WD-40 injector pump. But WD-40 injector pumps always need a lot of work. So Wendell and I got to talking, and then later on, I met Wendell up at Oscar Cook's when he bought this tractor, which is the 3060 Titan that he owns. And so I knew Wendell was interested in other things besides WD-40s. He also had a WD-40, but he was interested in something a little bit beyond that. And we got to talking about that, and he also bought a 3060 Mogul just a little bit later, and that 3060 Mogul was actually one of the two tractors that had been advertised in the Gas Engine magazine by John Tissey. And this is a picture of that tractor. I'm sure you've all seen it in shows, or many of you have. When I told Wendell, I said, man, I really like that 3060 Mogul. I'd sure like to find one. He said, well, the bad news is there's only 6 of them. And none of them are available. But I know a family that might be in a position to sell one someday if you wanted to get to know them a little better and try and make the connection. I didn't have the money to do anything like that. That was real money for antique tractors, so I just kind of let it go. But I did embark on a project with Wendell at the time to restore 503, the early WD-40. And so this is sort of the beginning of that process when Wendell had started to take it apart. It had seen the torch by this point to get the lugs off the rear wheels. Wendell always says that in tractor restoration there's a low point. And I think that's it. If you want to think about what the low point is, that's the low point for me, because I began to wonder if it would ever go back together. But anybody that knows Wendell knows there's a pretty good chance it was going to get fixed. And so then things started to go back in the right direction. This is 503 on its way back. There it is. It was running at this point. And mostly done just waiting for a few things like sheet metal. And we had to hand make a carburetor for it. That was because the carburetors that were on the production tractors, the later tractors, didn't have some of the features that had. So, and that's what it looked like when it was done. And so my hat's off to Wendell and his team. I think they did a great job. It's my first experience with having a tractor restored professionally, and I will tell you, when you get to the point of being about 100% over budget, so about twice what you thought it was going to cost you, you're getting pretty sick. But then you see the end result, and it's pretty neat. But we were considerably over budget.
You had that at Ford.
That was at the LaPorte Roundup in 2010. Okay, so I was interested in trying to find a Mogul. As far as why I was interested in the Mogul, again, I seem to be drawn to this mechanical complexity that, like the WD-40s have. And it's going to be hard to see because we don't have a good screen, but there are a number of pictures here I'm going to flip through fairly quickly that you get an idea. There's a lot going on with the Mogul. A lot of rods and shafts and pipes going off in all directions. It's not a well-organized machine. Well, it is once you get to know it. The first time you see it, you think it's just a plumber's nightmare. But there's stuff going everywhere. Lots of moving parts when it's running, so I like that. That's pretty cool. It's big. That engine is a 10-inch bore, 12-inch stroke, 2-cylinder engine opposed, and it runs the rated speed 380 RPM. So it gets along pretty good for an engine with a 12-inch stroke. Flip through these. But there's a lot of interesting detail on a lot of the little interesting parts to get lost or broken. So Wendell had told me about this family that had this tractor up in Minnesota, and it was finally didn't see the light of day. It was dragged out of the shed, and it was put on an Kurt Almond online auction, probably around 2012, somewhere in that range. And they held the auction. The family decided not to let it go for the price that it bought, and it was in kind of rough shape, and it ended up going to a collector in South Carolina. And I have a number of pictures on here of this tractor. I mean, you get the idea. It's kind of got a more or less the right color paint on it, but it's not in very good shape. It was done with a brush. I kind of call it the clown car paint job. But, you know, it's an honest 3060 Mogul, and again, there's only somewhere between 6 and 7. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So I didn't get that tractor, obviously. I didn't even get a chance to bid on it. The bidding was high, but it wasn't high enough for the family to sell it. They ultimately sold it private treaty to the guy in South Carolina. But this project became available, and it's a lot of pieces of a 3060 Mogul, but it's not a complete tractor. And so when you talk about people working on old prairie tractor projects, this is kind of what you're facing. It's just piles and piles of pieces. And that's essentially what I ended up buying to start my Mogul collection. It was all these parts. And it was a lot of good stuff, but it's a long way from being a tractor. It's going to take a lot of work to bring it back. Kind of skip through this stuff, a lot of engine parts. I mean, a lot of critical stuff that would be hard to make if you had to make it 20 inches wide. So this is why there's a lot of tractors are long. And yet I'm told it's a small prairie tractor. The other interesting piece about that tractor, I knew when I bought it that at one time the tractor had belonged to the Duncan family in Cannon Falls, Minnesota, as Wendell's 3060 Mogul had also belonged to the Duncan family. Well, I found this article in the 1916 issue of Farm Implement magazine that talks about E.H. Duncan of Cannon Falls, Minnesota, and his endeavors with 45 and 3060 Moguls and his kids that ran them, and these were all, I knew his grandson I had actually met. It turns out my tractor my complete running Mogul is one of the Duncan Moguls. Wendell's tractor is one of the Duncan Moguls, and the third one that they mentioned in this advertisement was actually scrapped. But then when Wendell's tractor experienced its difficulty in the 1950s, the engine failed. They turned it into a parts tractor, and they found another 3060 Mogul that they put in service at that point. And it's one of the ones that still survives. So 3 out of the 6 complete survivors were owned by the Duncan family in Cannon Falls, Minnesota at one time, 2 of them when they were new. I thought that was kind of an interesting bit of history to run across, just searching for publications. I talk about there being between 6 and 7 3060 Moguls because of that project I'm putting together. That will be the 7th one if I'm successful in getting it going. Well, I couldn't stop while I was ahead. And so in looking through some of the old tractor books, I found pictures of a Mogul that looked like this, and I didn't know what that was. Had never seen anything like it. It turned out it was a 45 Mogul, but it was from the first 2 years of production. And there were no survivors of this type, with the fan cooling on the tower and hit and miss governing, which has to be just an awful thing to listen to, hit and miss governing 2-cylinder engine that size. But none had survived. In fact, the amount of parts that had survived from those tractors would have fit probably in the bed of a pickup. And I actually knew the man who had rounded up all the parts that there were from the 1910 to 1911 45 Moguls. And once again, I couldn't help myself. I had to buy another project. So this is the second project you see pictures of. This is what's left of a 1910 or 1911 45 Mogul. There are only 50 of the 1910s built. And some of you may have heard the story over the years about how they were built in a tent in Chicago, and that's partly true. At about 31st and Western Avenue in Chicago, where the McCormick binder works was, and later the tractor works. They built 50 tractors, and some of the assembly was done in a tent. Mostly they were stored in a tent. A lot of the machine work was actually done inside old buildings on machines that had been rescued from the scrap heap at the McCormick works and put back into service by these 10 guys headed by E.A. Johnson, that was supposed to put the first Moguls together. And so, I live about 60 miles from Chicago. I thought that's kind of interesting to have the Chicago connection. That was what I had started. I had made some progress on the early Moguls. Maybe not as much as I'd like. That's a friend of mine that does 3D computer work that's made me the drawings of all these parts, and we've assembled them in a computer model, and that's kind of where we're at. But it's what keeps me going and making parts. That's the engine for the 1910. And there were only 50 of those engines made, so it's not surprising that none of the parts ever survived. They were such a miserable tractor that the Duncans, who had actually owned a 1910 45 Mogul, said when they got their 3060, they wired the governor wide open on the 45 and drove it to the scrap heap. They were glad to see it gone. So naturally I had to build it. This is the frame for the 1910 on the left side of that picture. That's how far I've gotten with assembling the frame. And I've got front wheels and parts of the rear wheels. This is my shed. See, that's the 1910 frame at the bottom of the picture. That's some of my collection. The red W40 at the front, that's actually Dan Kennedy's former tractor. So it gets a prominent place in the shed. And that's the 1910 frame again. And that's the 1911 frame as it now stands. So from nothing to that is going pretty good. But it's a lot of hours at the drill press, a lot of time making parts. And then that's just a panoramic of sort of my layout at home now, the tractors that I had out on display at that time. Then, because I was interested in regulars at the beginning, farm hauls, I found this farm haul for sale, and it's actually a narrow trailer farm haul, which aren't terribly common. And more interesting than that is a very late serial number. There were, I think, about 200 tractors that were rebuilt after they were returned from Argentina. This is actually later than those, and they were built in 34. The F-20 had already been in production for a year. It took a year off in 33, but yes.
I have one.
Do you? What's your name?
136, 325.
Yeah, yours may be about the latest one there is. I think a lot of those late ones are.
The guy in Eagle Eye, the 136, 329.
Regular? Okay. So I recently got this tractor overhauled and put back on its feet. And these are a couple of nines that I have in the collection. I like them. The one on the left I bought from the original owner, who bought it new in 1946. And then the ID9 had been a municipal road grading tractor in a county near Portland, in the Portland, Indiana area. And I bought it from a friend. That's pretty much where we're left. I don't get a lot done real quick because I got 3 little girls that I'm raising, an 8-year-old and 2 5-year-olds, so that keeps me busy, and I recently retired from my job at Blue Cross of Illinois after 28 years, so that'll give me a little more time to get things done. I guess just to wrap up real quick, since we got about a minute left, the common theme in all this is that I like things that are complicated and difficult. Not finished quickly. I'm not. That's what I like to do. So the Moguls and the WD-40s kind of, and even the WKs to an extent, satisfy that itch. So I guess very quickly we're at time. But if you have questions, I'd be glad to stick around and answer any questions that you might have. If not, enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Gary.